Growing up as a lifelong wrestling fan is very difficult. Well, I consider it difficult anyway. So, this video is going to be me discussing my favorite time period of professional wrestling. The good and the bad. Just to be a bit fairer, I'm going to talk about positives and negatives. And I'm going to try and remember as much as I can during this period. And this period is roughly just going to be roughly around 2010, 2011. Now, I'm pretty sure some of you have remembered that I've said those were my favorite time periods as a professional wrestling fan. And I guess bits of 2012, 2013, and sometimes 2014 were not so bad. Like, I was a bit in the middle when it came to enjoying pro wrestling during the mid-2010s. Like, in the 2010s is kind of when I was really into it. But I think I grew to become more like how I am now round about 2016, 2017, where I'm a bit more open-minded and I understand the business a whole lot more. But I'm going to use my knowledge. I'm going to use the way I am now, and I'm going to go back in time, and I'm going to talk about my favorite time period. And let's see if I still feel the same way. Let's see if I still feel the same way about the time period I grew up. Do I still like it, or do I now share the same sentiment as many others? That it had its moments, but also it wasn't very good. So, let's go back to 2010. Let's go back to 2010. So, this is basically the year of 2010. So, we're coming off of 2009. And I thought 2009 was an okay year. I remember 2009 being Randy Orton's big year, when he won the Royal Rumble and had that big feud with Triple H. But I was never a fan of Randy and Triple H wrestling each other. So when it came to 2010, there's not much I remember. I do remember Edge winning the Royal Rumble that year, and he would go on to meet Chris Jericho at WrestleMania for the World Heavyweight title. And the unfortunate thing is that they were not the main event. This was still during the time period where they would say that the Royal Rumble winner would get the main event of WrestleMania, but they would not get the main event. So again, why would you even bother saying that the Royal Rumble winner gets the main event slot when they're not even the main event? So Elimination Chamber rolls around, and it was a bit of an interesting one. As John Cena would win the WWE title, but then would quickly lose it to Batista. And then at WrestleMania, and then we do the whole WrestleMania 26 thing, which I don't think WrestleMania 26 was that terrible. It wasn't great. There were some highlights, like Triple H putting over Sheamus. Or was that the one Triple H one? I can't remember. But I do remember Triple H in 2010 did put over Sheamus. Because 2010 was like the last year of Triple H as a full-time active wrestler. He would go into a part-time role going forward after that. And so the only thing I remember is that the Sheamus feud was Triple H's last big major program as a full-time wrestler. So Triple H did put over Sheamus. I can't remember if it was WrestleMania or if it was the pay-per-view after, but I do remember Triple H putting over Sheamus in a big way. Despite what I said, despite how I feel about Triple H as a booker, I will give him credit for doing the honors for Sheamus during that period. This was also the final year of Shawn Michaels as a full-time wrestler, as he would retire at that year's WrestleMania. And I will be honest, I will tell you guys this right now. I was honored that I was able to see Shawn Michaels wrestle. I was honored that I was still able to see The Undertaker wrestle. So, to me, I consider it an honor that I was still able to see so many of the great legends who really helped shape WWE into what it is today, and getting the honor to actually see these people retire did make me feel good. Because usually whenever you grow into a new era, you kind of usually don't see the old wrestlers anymore. Well, Jericho is still around, and so is Edge, only because he came back in 2020. But during that time period, we didn't know that Edge was going to be retiring about a year later. So yeah. It was a solid WrestleMania. One of the big negatives of that year's WrestleMania was Jack Swagger. He won the Money in the Bank that year, I believe. I believe he did. I believe he won Money in the Bank that year, and they tried to make him a world champion, which Jack Swagger's world title reign was a bit of a failure. And also they had Vicky Guerrero beat Kelly in a multi-divas tag match, which was something that really crawled my stomach, being a Kelly fan. And also the pin was even botched, so way to go, Vicky. So anyway, Randy Orton's Legacy faction ended in 2010 as well, when Randy, Cody, and Ted DiBiase kind of had a big feud in a triple threat match. So this was during the time when Randy Orton would finally turn face for the first time since 2004. So Randy's face turn in 2010 was the first time he was a face since 2004. So think about that. He was a heel for that long. So to see him turn face after Cody and Ted DiBiase basically screw Randy Orton out of the WWE Championship, it was a nice bit of fresh air for Randy Orton, but he will always be better as a heel, even though he does have his moments as a babyface. So after that whole feud wrapped up, Ted DiBiase went on his own to kind of have the similar gimmick to his father, and Cody Rhodes would become Dashing Cody Rhodes. And he would go off to SmackDown and he'd become Dashing Cody Rhodes. And also that year, this was also the final year of Batista as well. This is the final year we get to see Batista as well. And all that. So yeah, Shawn Michaels retires. Triple H as a full-time wrestler was coming up. And now we also see the end of Batista. He only stuck around for 2 more pay-per-views. When it comes to Extreme Rules 2010, I don't really remember this pay-per-view very much, but I remember CM Punk was in a rivalry with Rey Mysterio, and they were doing this whole thing of Straight Edge Society. Yeah, CM Punk was doing this Straight Edge Society thing. Jack Swagger's first defense as world champion, he would successfully win the world title via cashing in. Apparently, according to Jack Swagger, he was supposed to cash in on John Cena, but John Cena apparently refused to put Jack Swagger over. I don't know why. Maybe John Cena didn't think he should have lost the title to Jack Swagger. Maybe he didn't think Jack Swagger was ready to be WWE champion. But regardless, according to Jack Swagger, he was supposed to cash in on Cena, and Cena flat out refused. And so Jack Swagger ultimately cashed in on Chris Jericho after Edge beat the snot out of him. Edge would beat the shit out of him to allow Jack Swagger to use his briefcase. So Swagger's first defense as world champion was against Randy Orton, and he would actually beat Randy Orton clean. Yes, he would beat Randy Orton cleanly. So yeah, they're trying to build, as I said, they were trying to build Swagger up as a world champion, but in my opinion, it didn't work out very well. So, and also when it came to the women's division back at this time, or the Divas era, it was still the women's division. There was the Divas Championship and the Women's Championship. Both belts were still separate. They were not, like, unified yet. I can't remember when they got unified. I think they got unified in 2010. But, I think they were unified in 2010, if I remember right. But I can't really remember. But Beth Phoenix would ultimately win the WWE Women's Championship from Michelle McCool at the Extreme Rules pay-per-view. Edge would wrap up his rivalry with Jericho, and Cena would win another match against Batista. And then we get to Over the Limit 2010. This would be Batista's final match in WWE. When it comes to some of the matches, some of the highlights, Rey Mysterio wrapped up his rivalry with Punk, where he would shave his head. Orton would separate his shoulder during a match with Edge, and Eve Torres would successfully defeat Maurice to remain Divas champion, and John Cena and Batista would have their final match in an I Quit match. And so going forward, it was a bit interesting. And then things get a little bit interesting going forward as Batista says his final goodbyes to WWE as he ends up leaving. But this is where 2010, in my opinion, picks up a little bit. Around about this time period, Fatal 4-Way coming up, we get the debut of a new group known as the Nexus. People remember the Nexus fondly as Wade Barrett, as Wade Barrett leads a bunch of NXT rookies from the likes of himself, David Otunga, Justin Gabriel, Heath Slater, Michael Tarver, Skip Sheffield, who eventually became Ryback, Daniel Bryan, Darren Young, and many, many more. So, this became one of the biggest storylines in 2010. Wade Barrett and his Nexus. And I think 2010, this is one of the big highlights from 2010. Nexus. Nexus would cause a lot of havoc. When they debuted, they destroyed everything from the ring, tables, and everything. They would cause a whole bunch of chaos. They would interrupt a match between John Cena and CM Punk. And this would be where they would make their debuts. Just basically beating up everybody. And also another thing from 2010, I guess I should mention, was the return of Bret Hart. Bret Hart would come back to WWE since the Montreal Screwjob. And he was just given the role as general manager. I guess just because Vince felt like it, I guess. I mean, the guy couldn't wrestle anymore. But ultimately, he did have a few matches, Bret Hart. But because of his age and how much older he was, let's just say they were not very good because of his age. But regardless of that. But yeah, the whole Nexus thing was one of the biggest storylines in 2010. And then we head into the next pay-per-view, Fatal 4-Way. I'm only going to go by pay-per-view and kind of just go off any kind of major highlights from that show. Over on SmackDown, Drew McIntyre starts a feud with Kofi Kingston, and he kind of has this whole Chosen One gimmick. And I think people remember this version of Drew McIntyre fondly because it's their favorite version of Drew McIntyre because he has everyone's favorite song, Broken Dreams. We would eventually get a new Divas champion in Alicia Fox, and this would be the only major accomplishment she would ever get in her entire WWE career. Yep, this is her only accomplishment ever in WWE. So imagine if you were watching WWE way before then, and she was around during 2016, 2017, before she eventually got released, and when you hear them say she's a former women's champion, you'd probably be thinking, when did that ever happen? Yeah, so it happened in 2010, where she became the Divas champion. I think she ultimately lost it to Melina, because Melina came back. And here's the thing, and can I go on a little bit of a tangent here about this? I felt the women's division was actually pretty good. There was a lot of good wrestlers during this time period. From Kelly Kelly to Eve Torres, Gail Kim, Michelle McCool, Melina, Maurice, just loads. There were loads of good, talented women. I guess Beth, wasn't the biggest fan of her, and all that. But the Bella Twins and all them, there were some decent and good wrestlers in this whole era. There were some good women's wrestlers during this period, but because this period this period just gets destroyed because of the fact it was the Divas era. It's the era that fans didn't care about women's wrestling. But if you think about it more, there were a lot of good women's wrestlers during this time. I think even Mickie James is still around during this time. I can't remember. I think she might have been, or she might have left the company around about that time. I don't remember when Mickie left, but it might have been 2010, 2009. I can't really remember when she ended up leaving. But she did leave at some point. She did leave at some point during this time period, I think. But yeah, like, the point is, there were some very good women's wrestlers during this time period. And the unfortunate truth is that fans would rather just shit on this period because of the Divas era. There were actually some very good wrestlers. Hell, even AJ Lee is going to debut a year later. She debuts around about 2011. So AJ Lee debuts a year later. Caitlyn debuts a year later. Naomi and many other athletic women's wrestlers. And yeah, not a lot of them were good. Not all of them were good. But I think there were a lot more talented women in this time period, but fans really never gave them much of a chance because of the fact it was the Divas era. Because of the fact they were treated just as piss breaks. Because they were always treated as bathroom breaks. They were never taken seriously and they were never treated to the extent. But I just want to make that very well known. There are some really good women's wrestlers during this time period, but it's just a darn shame that they never really got the chance to really show the true potential they could have really brought. I look at that as a negative. It's a positive, there are a lot of good wrestlers during this time, but it's a negative that they never really got a chance to shine. And I think that's the biggest sad part. And I think Gail Kim leaves WWE around about this time period as well. 2010, 2011-ish. I think she kind of leaves WWE around about that time period. Evan Bourne, a young man who I was quite a big fan of, would get a huge win at this pay-per-view, defeating Chris Jericho. And that is something I really like. Someone like Chris Jericho putting over a younger star, elevating this younger star, and it doesn't hurt him all that much. This is why this time period was actually something I appreciated, because you'd see the more of the main eventers really help elevating the younger stars at the time that were on their roster. Rey Mysterio would become the new world heavyweight champion, so Jack Swagger's championship reign is already over after 2 months. Like I said, Jack Swagger's title reign was a complete and utter failure. He just was not a good world champion. He was just not a good world champion. He just was not a very good champion, and he would never sniff the main event ever again. I think his last championship he ever won was the United States title. I can't really remember for sure, but he didn't win a lot of titles during his time in WWE. So Nexus would get involved in the main event and help, and ultimately would lead into Sheamus becoming the WWE champion for the second time. And unfortunately, in 2010, this is when WWE decided to put the rocket on The Miz. The Miz would win the men's Money in the Bank on the Raw side, and on the SmackDown side, it was Kane, who would quickly cash in his contract immediately on Rey Mysterio and become the new World Heavyweight Champion. So yeah, Kane was actually given a legitimate run as a world champion during this time period. And honestly, Kane kind of deserved it because, you know, he hadn't really been given a fair world title reign at the top of the card. So to see him finally actually get a title reign was nice to see, especially if you were a Kane fan. So it was cool to see him finally get his big moment. So yeah, that's one of the bigger highlights. So yeah, again, the Nexus continues to run roughshod. The Nexus was the big story of 2010. The whole Nexus story was one of the biggest stories of 2010. And so I think that is one of the strong positives. There are some negatives in 2010, especially the aftermath of what happened with the Nexus. I will be honest, I was not a fan of how things ended with the Nexus, where the Nexus would ultimately lose to John Cena and his team. I really felt Nexus needed that win, and how even Wade Barrett has even talked about it in interviews, that he felt his team needed to win to really help solidify themselves as top main eventers, and he believes that the Nexus never really recovered from that Survivor Series loss. But here's the thing when it comes to the Nexus. When it comes to the Nexus, a lot of the members outside of Michael Tarver became successful. Wade Barrett was a 5-time IC champion. Heath Slater would get a couple of runs as tag champions with Justin Gabriel and Rhino. Ryback would become a former Intercontinental Champion. Darren Young would win the tag titles with Titus O'Neil. And obviously Daniel Bryan would become one of the more successful guys out of the Nexus. Yeah, for those who actually don't remember, Daniel Bryan was a part of the Nexus. But ultimately, he got kicked out pretty quickly. He ultimately got kicked out of it pretty quickly. So when it comes to Survivor Series 2010, which is probably a show I'll eventually do a Blast on the Past review on, but just for a quick rundown, Alicia Fox's only Divas title reign would come to an end at the hands of Melina. See, I told you she was the one that beat her, because I remember. Big Show would destroy the Straight Edge Society in a handicap match. Randy Orton and Sheamus would have had a good match, but that ended in disqualification. Undertaker would make his return because he was taken out when Kane would come back. When Kane would successfully retain his world title. I think it was at SummerSlam he made his return, but they were doing like this whole storyline. They were doing this whole storyline where it was like Kane was trying to find out who killed the Undertaker. So then we get to Night of Champions, and then we get to Night of Champions, and things are only gonna get better. Daniel Bryan would win the US title from The Miz, ending his US title reign, and then we get the title unification of the Divas and Women's Championships, where Michelle McCool would unify both belts. So yeah, Melina won the Divas title a month ago from Alicia Fox, only to drop it to Michelle McCool. Great little title reign there, Melina, which I was not personally a fan of. I was always a big fan of Melina. I felt she deserved better, especially during this time period. And again, the women were never given a lot of time. Their maximum amount of time would usually be 5 to 6 minutes. And I wish they would get more to tell stories. Cody Rhodes and Drew McIntyre would get a short-lived run as the WWE Tag Team Champions. Who remembers Cody Rhodes and Drew McIntyre as Tag Team Champions? And Randy Orton would win the WWE Championship in a 6-pack challenge. And also, apparently, Chris Jericho had to leave WWE since he didn't win the WWE Championship. And also, was this Wade Barrett's? Because I know Wade Barrett said that he had a title opportunity. So I do not remember if that pay-per-view was where he finally used his opportunity. But eventually, the Nexus would eventually win the tag team titles. I do know that Nexus did win the tag team titles at some point. And so the Hell in a Cell pay-per-view comes along, and Wade Barrett will defeat John Cena. And this is where the Nexus storyline got even more interesting, where John Cena lost to Wade Barrett, and now Cena had to join Nexus. So yeah, the Nexus storyline is still going, but you kind of feel at this point the fans have kind of lost interest. Because, like I said, I feel like the SummerSlam match they really should have won. But yeah, you can kind of feel like maybe the crowd are losing interest. But this was when, I believe, Michael McGillicuddy and Husky Harris eventually got added to the group. And Kane's rivalry with The Undertaker continued on. And then we get to the Bragging Rights pay-per-view, which is kind of like another... It's sort of like Survivor Series, but it's just Raw versus SmackDown. It's like, oh, instead of doing traditional Survivor Series matches, it's Raw versus SmackDown or whatever. But anyway, the Nexus, as I said, the Nexus would win the tag team titles from Cody Rhodes and Drew McIntyre, as it was David Otunga and John Cena that would win the championships. Natalya started a feud with Lay Cool over the Divas title, which, if you saw my Survivor Series 2010 Blast from the Past review, you know Natalya eventually wins the championship from them. And then Kane, who goes 3-0 against The Undertaker in 2010. And this is what I mean. Like, Kane was finally given a legitimate chance as world champion. He basically went 3-0 against The Undertaker. Like, obviously the Nexus helped Kane win this one, because I remember the Nexus got involved and all that. Undertaker never wins Buried Alive matches. Has Undertaker ever won a Buried Alive match? Because every time they do one, it feels like it's always Undertaker losing. I genuinely do not remember any Buried Alive match that Undertaker had actually won. Because he usually loses a lot of his Buried Alive matches. And then Wade Barrett and Randy Orton would meet for the title. Wade would win by disqualification. And as you guys know from Survivor Series, if you saw it, this is kind of when the Nexus storyline slowly started to come to an end. This was when the storyline started to wrap up. This is when the story wraps up. Basically, this is when the story wraps up with Randy defeating Wade for the championship, and Cena got fired. And unfortunately, from this point on, this is when 2010 got really bad. Once the Nexus storyline wrapped up, unfortunately, this is when the worst part of 2010 starts, The Miz's championship reign, and the beginning of the annoying obsession that Michael Cole had with The Miz. Yes, this is where that all starts. The Miz uses his Money in the Bank contract on an episode of Raw to cash in on my guy Orton to win the championship. And as I said in my review of that Survivor Series review, I never believed The Miz was a main eventer. And this championship reign that he had legitimately proved it. His title reign proved he was not worthy of being a world champion. So, when it comes to TLC, there's not a whole lot to talk about. They did bring back the King of the Ring tournament, which Sheamus ultimately won. Edge would become the World Heavyweight Champion after ending Kane's title reign. And Edge's whole feud with Kane was about stealing Paul Bearer and all that stuff. And also, as I said, the unfortunate Miz would defeat Randy Orton in a rematch for the WWE title in a tables match. And this was basically the end of the Nexus storyline, as John Cena would defeat Wade Barrett, because John Cena was fired. Yes, he did get fired, but he eventually got rehired. He would eventually get rehired, and that's basically how 2010 ends. It ends with John Cena burying, in quotations, Wade Barrett with a bunch of chairs, and that's kind of how the Nexus storyline wraps up. Yeah, Nexus is still around, but it kind of cools off at this point. This is kind of when Nexus gets cooled off. 2011 is when Nexus gets cooled off, and they kind of eventually start splitting everybody off. Like, everybody kind of starts drifting off and doing their own thing. But yeah, 2010 onwards is where things just get a bit more interesting. I don't want this video going on for too long, so I feel like this is a good time to end the video here. So 2010, in my opinion, was a decent year. I thought it was a nice... The whole Nexus storyline was very interesting, and they could have done a whole lot more with it, but unfortunately, they kind of... Like, it started off strong, but after SummerSlam, I felt like the Nexus story really died out. I felt like they added Cena to the group to try and salvage it. They're like, oh, let's make it more interesting. Let's have Cena join the group to make it more interesting. But Cena was more in the group to try and destroy them from within. That's what he was more trying to do. He was trying to destroy it from within, but then he got told by the anonymous general manager, because Bret Hart was basically gone. They had that whole computer, and Michael Cole would always say, "Can I have your attention, please?" And that just got annoying real quick. And the whole anonymous Raw general manager thing. So yeah, that whole John Cena thing, that he had to do what Wade Barrett told him, otherwise he would be fired, was implemented into the story to make the whole Nexus storyline somewhat more interesting. But yeah, I wasn't really... I truly do feel the SummerSlam match is really when the Nexus storyline cooled off. Them trying to add Cena to it to make it a bit more interesting. And the WWE Championship, again, was like going back and forth between multiple different wrestlers. It like at the start of 2010, Sheamus was the champion at the start of 2010. Then it went to John Cena in February because Sheamus won the title on TLC in 2009, and then he'd have one title defense against Randy Orton, which would end in DQ because of legacy, and then he would drop the title to Cena inside the chamber, and then it would go to Batista for a month, and then Cena would win it and have a few matches with Batista, which would end Batista's career until he comes back in 2014. Oh boy, we'll get to that. We'll get to that. And we'll get to that if you want to hear me talk more about this. This is a new experiment of me talking about the years I enjoyed wrestling, and I go over the good and the bad. So this whole Nexus thing is good, but how they went with it afterwards I thought was bad. I wish they did more with the women, give them more storylines, but again, this was how the women were treated back then. And this was, again, the start of the whole Michael Cole having a big hard-on for The Miz, and we're going to be getting into one of the worst storylines of all time soon. And yeah, Miz being the Money in the Bank contract winner and then eventually becoming WWE champion, to me, is a big negative, because I never viewed Miz as a main eventer. I never have. You might feel differently, but I felt this title reign during that time period proved that Miz was not a worthy WWE champion. He could never win his matches clean. I know he's a heel, he's not supposed to, but I just felt he could never hang with guys like Randy and Cena. I just felt he could never hang with the main eventers. I just felt he could never hang with the top guys in the company. I just felt he could never hang with them. Like, Jericho's now gone. Edge is still hanging around. He's like a face now. And all that. Kelly wasn't featured much during 2010. She didn't get on a lot of pay-per-views. But don't worry, 2011 is going to be her year. And I'll get into her when we get to 2011. We'll get to her when we get to 2011. Because 2011 is going to be her year. 2011 was her year. So, and all that. So, yeah, man. I think 2010, there was definitely some strong parts and negatives. Like, again, the Nexus was the main story of 2010. And then after that, as I said, it kind of died out after Survivor Series, and fans kind of stopped caring. Wade got got like 3 different chances to win the title. I just don't think I don't think they viewed him as a world champion. Well, I think Wade would have definitely been a future world champion, but I think injuries and all that other stuff really plagued him later on in his career. But ultimately, 2010 was an interesting time. It was an interesting time, and I personally didn't really hate 2010 all that much. I definitely thought it was a decent year. If you suspend your disbelief, knowing John Cena ruined the Nexus, you would probably enjoy the Nexus storyline. And look, I'm not going to fully put the blame on Cena, okay? I guess I shouldn't fully put the blame on him. It is technically also Vince's fault. He initially was planning on having Nexus win, but then he changed his mind because he thought like SummerSlam needed a happy ending. Like Vince was originally planning on having Nexus go over, and then he would change it. I think he would change it later in the day or something. I don't know. Wade told the story that they were originally going to win, but then it got changed. And then it got changed to Cena's team winning. And even Edge and Jericho have even told the story, and they kind of put the blame mainly on Cena. So it's kind of hard to really they put the blame on Cena. They put the blame on him as well. So yeah, you kind of think maybe it probably might have been Cena's fault, but it's also creative's fault for changing their minds. I think they should have stuck with it. But regardless, I thought 2010. It was fine. I thought it was fine. But we'll get into 2011 in the next video. If you guys like this concept, or I go over the good and the bad of certain years, or I run down the pay-per-views, and if I can remember the storylines, and if I say if they were good or bad, let me know. I truly believe the only strong positive I can give for 2010 was the Nexus storyline. The negatives is The Miz becoming Money in the Bank winner and eventually winning the title. And I can also say ruining the Nexus storyline is another negative. So while the Nexus storyline is a positive, it's also a negative because of how it eventually got ruined. And The Miz, he's also a bit of a negative as well. He's also a giant negative, being the WWE champion by the end of 2010. And of course, Michael Cole eventually starting to have his big hard-on for The Miz. And when we get into 2011, oh boy, I've got a lot to say about 2011. I kind of consider 2011 my favorite year, but we'll see if my mind changes. As of right now, when it comes to 2010, I don't have a lot of negativity to say. Outside of Nexus storyline got ruined and The Miz. You might have for those who remember 2010, you guys let me know, what did you guys think was the positive and the negatives of 2010? So that's where I'm going to leave it. Thank you guys for listening. And if you guys like this concept of me going over the good and the bad of each year, of a certain year, I'll go over it and I'll give you guys my opinion. But it has to be a time period that I remember mostly. Don't ask me to go back to the 1980s and look at the good and the bad of the 1980s or the 1990s, because I didn't watch pro wrestling then. So I wasn't really into it then. But regardless, if you guys like this concept, let me know. Hit that like button, subscribe, and I will see you all next time.